I'm Daryl DePriest,
I'm Todd Pleasant.
and thank you for listening to the Regular Joes.
Yes.
Seems like.
Yes, yeah.
Regular Joes, Todd's podcast.
Thanks for listening.
I'm often on. And it's a great podcast. So we originally presented this presentation in 2017 at JoeCon. And it is based on work that Todd and I have done, meeting and getting familiar with and getting the stories from the actual designers who worked on the Adventure Team G.I. Joe line. And one thing we realized, and I will fully say, I worked at Hasbro for 18 years, from 2001 to 2018 when I was let go. And during that time, Brian Savage was always needling me. He says, you need to find out if anybody there worked on the Adventure Team, because nobody knows who the Adventure Team designers are. Everybody knows, thanks to the John Micklig book and the work that John did, who all the 1960s team was, and the 1980s team, a quarter of them were just up here. Everybody knows that story, but really the Adventure Team story is something that's untold. So I kept saying to Brian, yeah, I'll get around to it someday, but I was like really busy. And then finally, in the probably around 2015, I'm like, Brian's right. We've got to do something about this. And I started asking around, and there was one gentleman who was there at the time named Fred Eddins. He was an engineer, and he was kind of a super engineer, like he knew everything. Fred actually began his career in 1974 at Hasbro, and he was still there 35 years later. And I went to Fred. He turned out to be like the only one, and he was the gate, the door that opened that allowed us to connect with the other folks. So I want to, which slide are we on? We need to see the slides, right?
That's okay. You want to do the Surgicos?
So, yeah. But I need to see what's on the screen, though.
Okay.
So I'll sit over here.
So I will tell you, from meeting these guys, when we actually get a chance to meet these guys, I have never met a group of people who were more into what they did 30 years ago. They were so excited about this. This was like the best job they ever had, and they were super eager to talk about it, which is just very ironic in that, like I said, these guys are virtually unknown, but we're just absolutely loved what they were working on and what they had a chance to do. They had their frustrations like everyone else, but it was great.
And the story really starts with this figure here. This is called a Surgicos Joe. And what it is, it looks like a muscle body G.I. Joe. It's made from the same tools, but there's some weird stuff, like the torso and stuff is weird. I picked this up in a lot of G.I. Joes I bought in Rochester, New York, back in the 1980s, and I had it ever since then, and I didn't know what the heck. I actually had two of these. Didn't know what the heck they were. It's always been a mystery, but I took this over to Fred Eddins, and I said, Fred, you worked at Hasbro in the 1970s. Can you tell me what the heck this is? And Fred said, oh, let me tell you about that. Well, I don't know exactly what that is, but let me introduce you to some people. And so Fred basically introduced us to a designer named Bob Hudson, who was kind of the main gateway. And so I think, yeah, we'll go here. So this is Fred Eddins right here. This is an old-timey picture from the 1970s taken in the Hasbro factory building. So you've got Fred. You've got Bob Hudson there. He's that sharp-looking guy in the blue shirt. We'll get to him in a second. The other guys are Jim King and Dent Goodyear. We don't know a lot about what they did or what roles they played. Maybe that's a future conversation with Bob. Bob is still with us, and in fact, he sent us more stuff this morning to work into the presentation because he really is interested in telling that story for the guys. And then a fellow that will loom large in this presentation is Carl Cederholm. Carl was the sculptor hired in 1967 onto the G.I. Joe team. He didn't work exclusively on G.I. Joe, but he was the primary sculptor from 67 all the way to 77 when he left Hasbro and went out on his own to be a toy inventor, basically. But he sculpted pretty much everything that Hasbro needed. He did it all, and he was a pack rat, which is awesomely important to the story. So not pictured, there's a whole bunch of folks here, including, you might notice the last name down on the list is Ron Rudat. So Ron started his career in the art department at Hasbro doing odd tasks, and we actually have in tomorrow's presentation a couple of never-before-seen Ron Rudat art adventure team illustrations that we'll show. And we'll talk about that tomorrow. So there's a lot of folks involved in the, in the adventure team there. So today we're going to focus on these guys, and we're going to start with Bob. So Todd, were you going to do this, or was I going to talk about this section?
Go ahead.
Yeah. So one of Bob's very first projects at Hasbro was he was given the task of designing this little metal detector. This was, simple task for a designer to get into. He came from industrial design school. He was fresh out of school and was just given that simple task of designing this kind of metal detector for the missile recovery set. And then that, from there, was the gateway. He proved to be a very adept designer, an excellent. He became a team leader, the group project leader for the early concept department. And he was really good at brainstorming ideas for vehicles. And this was his very first project, the mobile support vehicle. Oh, we forgot the helicopter. Darn.
We're going to get the helicopter.
With the hook.
We're getting there.
No,
We're going to get there.
We're getting there. Okay, very good. Very
There have
good.
been some changes. Okay.
Very
we
good.
forgot to bring the helicopter.
That's what I meant. We forgot to bring the helicopter. No. So, so Bob's designs include the training center, the troubleshooter, the seismograph, the manta ray that goes with the Devil of the Deep set. When Hasbro was moving away from the wooden footlocker, he designed the plastic footlocker. And that's a kind of funny story. Like if you go into just about any garage in Rhode Island, you will find wooden footlockers. They were so common because they broke very easily as they were assembling them. They were assembled with staples, very thin wood, so you guys find them that they have chips. They never sold them with chips, but if they got chipped, they're just like, we got to get rid of this. People took them home every day, and they just filled garages through Rhode Island with parts. And the Skyhawk was one of his legendary creations. That is a huge story. He really has told us all about that. Fred, very interesting guy. Fred just started in 1974. We'll get to that in a minute. And he's known for the concept of the Avenger pursuit craft, as well as some other epic items like the Black Widow Rendezvous, which is one of my favorite all-time sets, and the Super Joe Terron. So let's talk about the Avenger pursuit craft for a minute. So Todd, you may want to introduce this one, right?
Okay. So this is really interesting. It's one of the later vehicles, and like one of the things we learned from talking to these guys is, well, like right now, you're looking for ideas, you go on the internet. These guys didn't have that as a resource. So they were reading popular science, popular mechanics, aviation magazines, things like that, and trying to get the inspiration for what they would do next. They had an edict not to do military-style stuff, so they wanted things that were out there that were adventure-themed, but on the cutting edge. But again, they found these inspirations where they could. And so the design of this, again, based on a seaplane. Now we've seen, a lot of us seen these pictures, but like this picture before. You notice, I said you've got, I said, yeah, this is pretty close to the final design here. This is the, no, we're going back too far. Okay. So one of the things that, in the course of this design, we'll see some slides later of the development of this. It was rear heavy. And so just a little thing like tilting the landing gear wheels backwards, so the angle, if you look down, it's kind of a V shape, made it stable. One other thing that you notice on this, and you notice on a lot of the vehicles, is the holes. Okay.
Check this out right here. You see a series of holes. If you go back at one slide, you'll see it. These holes, they're on the back. They're everywhere across this vehicle.
And consistent throughout a lot of the adventure team stuff, you're going to see these holes. We call these Hudson holes, okay? So this is kind of a Bob Hudson trademark. Okay, where he could, he put holes in, and it was for two reasons. The first reason was it made it look cool and futuristic, okay? The second reason, anybody? There's less plastic. So they were always under the gun to use less plastic. And that's one of the things. So one of my favorite stories that he told us was in designing the Adventure Team helicopter. And they were determined that the helicopter was going to have a winch. And costing came back and they said, yeah, we can't do a winch. Winch is going to be too expensive to do a winch. And so they said, well, what is too expensive? And they said, you could do a winch if it would only add 2 cents to the production cost of the helicopter, which seemed ridiculous. And that's why they went back and they redesigned that single clip with the spool and the hook, which added 2 cents to the cost of the helicopter. One of my favorite toys as a kid, I played the hell out of that. I broke at least 3 of them, running and holding them while pumping. But think about how much less fun that would have been without that little clip and that winch to pick up the stolen idol and whatnot. And that's what these guys were doing. They were thinking about the playability of these things. They weren't just, okay, here's the assignment, let's get this done. They were thinking through and thinking,
Yep.
how is a kid going to enjoy this best?
It was all about the playability. So they lit, when I grew up with the Adventure Team, the toys they made inspired unbelievable stories and imagination. These guys were living it. They were thinking about everything. Bob Hudson would not let the helicopter go out without a winch, even though he only had 2 cents to work with. So
this is
unbelievable the determination to
the
make
last great wave of toys with no IP attached to them.
Yeah.
And this is so you had to look at this and figure out the story yourself. You had to look at this and say, oh, I know what to do with this, or collaborate with your friends. And that's what they were looking for with this.
So for the next story, I want to shift our attention to the Hasbro building on Broad Street in Central Falls, Rhode Island. This is where the Adventure Team team was headquartered. All of Rhode Island, all of the design for Hasbro was in this building here. And this building still exists today. However, Hasbro sold it last year. They owned it up until this year. This building is probably a brownfield riddled with oil. It's where toys were manufactured for probably 50 years. They used to do the production for Play-Doh here. They did all the real American vehicles. The team that was here talking about going to the assembly line to actually fine-tune the production, all the real American hero vehicle tools were done here. And it's a 4-story building. I can't tell you what's on some of the floors, but there's a lot of very interesting artifacts there. But the design team was headquartered in the front part of this building, and this is where they originated, they created. It was the early visualization, and then whenever they had their designs, they sent them over to an engineering department to get them turned into physical 3D forms. But what we want to talk about today is this, the first flight of the Skyhawk.
Coincidentally, this was Fred's first day, right?
Fred Eden's very first
day. So now picture this is your first day, and so the Skyhawk was, Bob told us just earlier, what was it?
So the Skyhawk story is actually, it's very complex, and we'll boil it down. In 1973 or 74, Hasbro was looking for new vehicles, new ways. The management challenged them. Let's find new ways for G.I. Joe to, do things like fly. They were looking for less expensive vehicles, things like that. And so Bob had been inspired by a popular science article that he had seen in I believe he said 1960. And he never forgot it. It was something that NASA was exploring for returning either satellites or things from space. It was a particular wing. It was a V-shaped wing called the Rogallo wing. And NASA patented this wing, which meant that it was actually public domain for anybody to use because it's a government agency. And when 14 years later, when Bob and the team were looking at new ideas, he said, he went to his engineering team. He says, have you guys ever, looked at ways to get G.I. Joe up in the air to have him fly? And to a person, they said it's impossible. There's too much weight. You can't do this. And Bob said, there's this design, this Regalo wing. I think we can do it. And they said it was impossible, but he made an early concept for it. This isn't the concept, that was later. He made a concept, kind of flew it across the conference room, and there's enough juice there that they said, oh, we should look into that, the Regalo wing. And
so they developed they had a prototype manufactured. It's ready to go. This is Fred's first day. So imagine you show up your first day of work and your colleagues say, we get this great, we get this prototype. This is going to be this new product. Nobody's ever made anything like this. Kids can fly it with a kite, with a G.I. Joe. And somebody says, do we know that if it will actually fly? So they decide on their own that they should do a test of this. So behind the headquarters here is a field, okay? Now, on the other side of the road, beyond the field, now you see this field here, that seems like the obvious place, okay, to maybe test it out. We're not sure why, but they went to the baseball diamond.
I'll tell you why, because that stadium is locked. That is a gated stadium. There's always, and there's been a lock there for 50 years. So you can only play it, I guess, when the coach opens it up.
Okay, so they went beyond to the smaller baseball diamond, okay, which unfortunately is very, very close to the Blackstone River, okay? So proof of concept. The Skyhawk did indeed fly, okay? It flew for a distance of about 200 feet and then went into the Blackstone River.
Snapped off its cable.
Cable snapped into the river. And it continued. So now this panic rush of engineers all of a sudden realizes that this very expensive prototype is in the water and going downstream. So the first attempt at rescue was at the Roosevelt Avenue Bridge here. They had a hook. They were trying to snag it as it went by. They didn't get it.
And this is a very expensive prototype. There's a lot. There's
one
a
of a
lot
kind,
on the
very
line
expensive prototype. Okay. Okay. So it continues now in true Adventure Team G.I. Joe fashion. At the last second, instead of going over the waterfall, it's rescued and pulled off the bank over on the other side here.
And it's the youngest member of the team, like this intern guy. He just decided to wade into the river and get it without even asking. And so he brought back the thing, and Bob gave him the rest of the day off.
Yes. Because he was also soaking wet. But, yeah.
And there's our hero. So there's Bob today and Fred with a super cool piece of art that Fred has in his garage that unfortunately he wouldn't sell me. He wanted to keep that, but I've never seen that store sign before.
He'll keep trying, though.
Yeah, we'll keep trying. So let's talk about Carl now. So Carl Cederholm was responsible for sculpting all the figures for Joe, and we thank him because he was a pack rat. Not only did he save what he worked on, but he saved what other designers were throwing away and getting rid of. I'd like to think he didn't steal them. He took them out of the trash and took them home. And that has opened up a lot of very interesting stories here. Now, Carl passed away in the 2000s, but his son, also named Carl, he revered his father, really respected him, what he did. You could tell when I was talking to Carl. But his son saved all his archives. He was able to do this. And Bob Hudson basically said, you need to go to talk to Carl's son because he's got a lot of interesting things. So Bob maintained family friends with them. So I went down to see Carl's son, and he really told me about his dad. And one of the first things that Carl told me was about what his dad did before he came to Hasbro. And his dad was a sculptor, and one of his passions was furniture design. So he designed these super cool mid-century furniture pieces. And if you notice the Corona bottle that I put into the picture up there, these are all roughly in Joe scale. He didn't do this to show Hasbro what he could do in scale. He was doing these on his own before he applied to Hasbro just because he loved to build things, build mid-century scale and miniature. And I don't know, he must have aspired to be a furniture designer, but he ended up at Hasbro. He actually used these to show him as his calling card, like, this is what I can do. This was his kind of resume, if you were, his portfolio, and that helped helped him get in. But and Carl still has those pieces. I would love to add those to my collection, but he's keeping those. Another thing that that Carl had was this fellow right here. This is the, in 1975, when the new lifelike body came out, Carl engineered all that body. He sculpted all the pieces, and one of the things that they had to do, because of the eagle eye in the head, that was a mechanism that was going to be inserted in the head. They had to make that, instead of the roto mold that we were used to with the G.I. Joe, they'd pull those out of a hot mold. Instead, they made an injection molded head for the eagle eye, and this is the master sculpt that was used for that head. And this is sculpted up. This thing is made of auto industry Bondo. It's heavy as heck. And so at first, Carl, I will flash forward. This now resides on a shelf in my collection. So Carl eventually let this go. So I'm a proud owner of this one right here. These are some of the other things that Carl had in his collection. It's a collection of muscle body prototypes and parts that showcase, unfortunately, the parts on the left, it's not a complete story of every piece that was sculpted, but it has some of the early casts. It has brass tooled parts that served as the masters, the sculpt masters for these, which is really cool. So I've got the upper arms. There's an eagle eye prototype head, which is really cool. And then just some unjointed castings that just showed the musculature that they were trying to achieve. So it's a partial, kind of archaeological record of the steps that Carl went through to get this figure right. And really what they want to do is, because it had a new manufacturer, they wanted to make sure that they were putting it together right and it worked. So there's a lot of steps involved in this. And that resulted in a bunch of different early prototypes that all used elastic to pull the bodies together, really testing it for the eventual rubber bands that were used. And the next slide actually shows, this was in Carl's collection. He had a huge bag of these muscle body parts, and it shows how inside, these are all unassembled, and it shows how inside, all the pieces go to connect these together. I think the Stovall's probably know this, better than anybody, how these things are put together, but I had never seen one pulled apart like that until I opened this bag, and I thought that was, really cool display. These are some of the other things that Carl did, the Defenders. Now, the Defenders have an interesting story. I think everybody has probably heard the tale, which is true, that because G.I. Joe was getting knocked off by so many other companies, that the executives at Hasbro decided, if they can knock them off, we should knock off ourselves too. And so that's how the Defenders got created. It was designed to really get a piece of the money that wasn't going to them. And semi-successful, I guess, or not successful. We all know it was like the last years of the 12-inch Joe, as it was giving way to Super Joe, which is also the next thing that Carl worked on. So Carl sculpted and prototyped the Super Joe. He did not have a huge record on this. There was a ton of clothing, prototype clothing for Super Joe, but not a lot of the figures survived. There wasn't a lot of the parts for this, but we do know that he was responsible for sculpting that. And now we turn our attention to part 2, which is something we learned based on something in the Carl Cederholm archives.
So this is the secret, surprising, and in some ways shocking story behind Mike Power, Atomic Man. So Mike Power, there he is in all his glory. Okay. So one of the things that we've seen, as we looked at the old catalogs and some of the tags in some of the very early release figures, you don't see Atomic Man, you actually see Bionic Man. And in this catalog, here you see the Bionovac instead in the play outpost testing unit.
That was their intention to very deliberately brand it Bionic, which we know is a trademark.
So the initial thought was this was because they wanted to like trade off the $6 million man idea as much as possible, and then pulled back from that for, for litigation reasons or whatever. But there's actually a little bit more to that. We've found through exploration that Hasbro actually put in a bid to get the license to produce a $6 million man figure. And Mike Power is actually the product of that. So he wasn't really a knockoff of Steve Austin or $6 million man figure. He was a proposed alternative version of the $6 million man who they did not get the license and went to Kenner.
And this very figure here is the one that was found in the Cedarholm archives as this. I put it on an Atomic Man figure, but it's the red tracksuit designed and mocked up by the Hasbro the seamstress team there for the pitch, the presentation to Universal on what it could be if G.I. Joe took in the $6 million man license.
Yeah. So. Oh, there we go.
And okay. we do know that $6 Million Man, Kenner's version, the line went to Kenner. It actually was out in the market as early as '74, I think, is when it debuted. The show came out '73, $6 Million Man came out in '74, and Atomic Man didn't debut until 1975.
So they basically sat on this and decided that it was worth going ahead with. And let's see. Nope. Okay, goodbye, Mike. Okay. So, yeah. So it gets worse. Okay.
So it said, and clearly $6 Million Man was a very successful line. It along with the knockoffs on one end, were stealing Hasbro's thunder from the Joe line. So, what better way than to go after and try and get a piece of that $6 Million Man line?
So, Mike has a very different head than the other G.I. Joe figures. It was a different sculpt to begin with.
Yep.
It was done hurriedly because they were trying to get in a bid for this. It was 2 years before it was on the shelves, but they made this in a hurry to try to get a bid for the $6 Million Man contract.
So what we're going to show you here is a series of 9 heads that Carl had in his collection that at first didn't make any sense until you kind of lay them out, and in almost linear fashion emerged this story. Now, usually, I worked at Hasbro for a long time, and I will tell you, when somebody wants to make a head, they usually sculpt an original head based on some reference. You get reference photos from somebody. You can either make it look like somebody specific, or you can, kind of make up your own thing if you don't want to trade on somebody's IP. That's usually the way it's done. You just create a head sculpt, and then you're off to the races in production. This was not that. This was, as Todd was alluding to, this was a very different process that started with a unique point that we're going to show you in a second. So first of all, based on the head, this is a production Atomic Man head that has never been painted, so it's pulled from the rotational mold. You note the scar on the cheek. So this is like as final as it can get before you paint it. So probably a sample or something that was pulled.
And the full-length neck.
Yep, full-length neck. So number 8 is an interesting one, pre-final, pre-final one with a slightly different hairline and shorter neck, just an odd kind of in-betweener.
Painted scar.
Yeah, what's that?
Painted scar.
Yeah, with a painted scar. And number 7 is even like an earlier refinement where the head looks a little bit chunkier, and that also has a painted scar. So they hadn't yet done the painted scar, and I have here a rotational mold as well from what I think is probably version 8 of the one you're seeing here. So this is, you can all look at this later. This is a rotational mold. It's very crude on the outside, but inside with, when you fill it with hot plastic, you can basically pull out while it's still molten hot. The whole head comes out through this little aperture. And this has an unpainted excuse me, there's no scar in this mold. So this is like an example that shows that they were intent on molding it at first without a scar until they put that identifying scar on the figure, because they wanted to make sure, like G.I. Joe, all G.I. Joes had scars. So this kind of a late game addition to add the scar.
As he was added to the G.I. Joe line, as opposed to being a separate figure.
So we're going to continue our kind of backwards journey, and we'll look at really stage number 6. So the interesting thing here is that this head, it doesn't really look like the Atomic Man that we saw on the previous ones. It's still cruder. It's kind of chunkier. And Todd, you have a good, I think, perspective on this guy.
Well, he's got a little bit heavier brow, okay? And this one at this point, if you kind of squint, he does look a lot more like Lee Majors than he does Mike Power. Yeah. Okay? And you see that these, like I said, are moving away from that because they're creeping a little bit closer to the source. Now, and I think this was the stage, was the kind of lead, and again, also the eyes being squintier. Yeah.
So the other thing we don't have when we look at this timeline is actually how long each of these steps took. And, you know, Todd really has a good suggestion here that this actually could have been Hasbro's sculpt to propose to Universal to make a Lee Majors looking $6 million man figure. So, and this is where it could have, you know, they could have started, and then from there they took this and made the Atomic Man figure. Which, if they really did that, it's interesting because they said they want something. The intention was to have something that looked like a Lee Majors, but not quite Lee Majors. Like, let's make it look more G.I. Joe-like, and then put a scar on it, so it's clearly not.
So from this to Mike Power, his eyes were made larger, the hairline was altered slightly, he was given longer sideburns, and the face was narrowed. So
yeah, exactly. We work our way backwards. So number 5 is the precursor to number 6. You can see it's even. There's a lot of similarities, but I think you know, the eyes are a little more sunken. They continue to change the hair, but number 5 is derived from number 4, which is number 4 is a very interesting treatment here. It actually has a sculpted on clay hairpiece. Now, anytime you see the silver paint in these prototypes, it's a mold release agent. So they paint, so what you do is you sculpt something, and then you put that spray paint on, and then you make a mold from that head, and that silver paint agent helps your mold to release from that, so they don't get bound up together. So number 4 is what was used to get to number 5. There might have been another in-between step, I'm not sure, because the lines are very crudely carved in that head, and they may be exact, I'm not 100% sure. But then going backwards, now you'll notice that this number 3 is a G.I. Joe size head, but the hairline, can you flip back, Todd? The hairline on number 4 is flipped. So that's what they did, is they took a sculpt of that number 3, carved off the head, carved off the hairline, and molded a new one that was on the other side. They flipped it. So this was a deliberate flip for some reason. I've never seen anybody get to a final head sculpt with this kind of path. So the fact this exists is really interesting. So they took number 3, they flipped the head, and number 2 is a crude version of what number 3 is based on. And that has that mold release agent on it. So they developed number 3 from number 2.
2 is also a bit smaller. You don't see it as much in the picture, but it's a bit smaller than the Joe size head that's number 3.
But the most fascinating thing of all was the precursor of all of these, which is number 1. So this whole path to get to Atomic Man, possibly through Lee Majors, was derived from starting with a sculpt of Big Jim. A Big Jim head was the precursor to Atomic Man. And it's crazy. We don't know why they would start with the Big Jim head. It doesn't make any sense. This isn't the Super Joe line. They're not doing anything with the 9-inch figure. But I guess they liked that head sculpt as something that was very different than what they were
they're
doing.
under a time crunch. They're under a time crunch to get this prototype made, and Joe does not in any way resemble Lee Majors, but you can see a little bit of the jawline and the nose and whatnot, and they could see that as a starting place.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So we have a story here that still may be missing a couple pieces, but the start is to get something done quick. Big Jim kind of resembled Lee Majors already. Let's just embiggen that and make a $6 million man. But then, they forwarded right through that to get a piece of the $6 million man market after that came out.
So Mike Power is the love child of Big Jim and the $6 million man. It's sad but true.
And then there were some concepts and prototypes in the Cedarholm collection that we wanted to share with you as well. So first of all, in one of the Hasbro catalogs, when they were first soliciting the Adventure Series cards, which came out in the window boxes, there were a bunch of concepts that were proposed, some of which came out in different form. They lost some of the accessories, but one of the interesting ones was the the Jungle Survival Adventure that had this yellow backpack. It was a yellow cloth backpack, and it eventually became just the plastic radio that already existed. Soft goods is often very expensive to do, so we actually have that survival pack. The lettering is a little bit different, so it was like a second version or something like that. So that was in the Cedarholm collection. So that concept survives, at least in that form. And looking at the lettering on the survival pack, that lettering is found on a couple of other things. So this was probably hand done or hand stenciled. And one of those is this sleeping bag. It says just a USA sleeping bag, which nothing like that has ever come out in the Joe line. But it was found in with all of these Adventure Team prototypes. So something we assumed that they were looking at that never pulled the trigger on. This is a series of concepts that were developed for the Adventure Team, and these exist out on the internet. I think they came up on eBay one year. Somebody bought them. People got copies of these. Barry Kay actually sent me the copies that he had of this. These were a bunch of Adventure Team concepts, some of which went into production, and some of which did not. So it's just, kind of they were looking at all kinds of non-military things. But the interesting thing is these were all prototyped. And we have a couple of the examples of these sets in the Cedarholm collection. Not everything, but this one does exist. This is a Desert Adventurer. It came with this yellow anorak, short brown shorts, and we've got one of the socks, but this was just a Desert Adventurer. Interesting, kind of not as great as I think the sets were produced. I'd have to think Hasbro made the right choices in the ones that they did go forward with, like Hurricane Spotter and Aerial Recon, sets like this. And here's another one, Mountain Adventure. I mean, this is about as plain as you can get for a set, but based on, you see it in the Polaroid, the suit exists. Interestingly, there was also a pair of gloves that made of that same colored fabric that also came with the set. So at one time, I'm sure they were looking at including gloves with the set. I love these concepts. High Voltage Escape was earlier prototyped as just a printed pattern on a jumpsuit. And it looks like there's a Barbie outfit that's called like a Harlequin or something like that. It kind of looks like that. And I think once they saw it, they said, it's not quite what we wanted. So they went with that very frustrating silver suit, which looks really cool. It's frustrating to put on. And what do you put it on? I always put it on a black suit because it looked so cool. But G.I. Joe didn't even make a black suit, so that's a knockoff black suit. So that's a prototype. And the next one is really fascinating, and we did bring that to show too. So my original thought was that this is a volcano jumper prototype, but there's something very interesting about this figure or this outfit here, in that unlike the volcano jumper, which has a hood that comes completely off, you just lift it off, that's not the case with this one. It is sewn in the back. So, and the fact it's white, it makes me think immediately of a hazmat type of suit. So it's it could be coincidence that this was an early volcano jumper prototype, or it could be that they were looking at a hazmat type of suit and just didn't pull the trigger on that. But that's, kind of all we know about that. But it's awesome to imagine that, we could have had a hazmat adventure, which would have been super cool. It's something for Greg to think about doing for the for Cotswold.
Don't give him any more ideas.
And Sean would have to build some 3D parts for that. We do know that the team, when they came up with new concepts, had a lot of fun. So Todd and I heard stories about when lifelike hair was first introduced onto the team. That was Dave.
Dave, yep.
Yeah, Dave. So we'll hear about him tomorrow. But they just flocked everything.
Everything.
They were like kids.
And like, he was putting Hitler mustaches on, he was doing all these kinds of things that were never going to be made, but they really wanted to work the limits of it and see what they could do, how big and how small. And they experimented with a bunch of different types of things, and we ultimately ended up with the hair and the beard that we got, because that worked the best. That could applied the most evenly, and they worked out what the correct thickness was, and so that,
But-
some of them are a little hairier.
But they acted like kids when they got these new technologies, and they flocked everything like Scott does. He just flocks everything, and then when they were experimenting with vac metal, they went crazy with vac metal. And when they were concepting Bullet Man, which is a strange concept to begin with, and
Greatest concept.
the greatest concept. That is true. All hail, right? All hail. But, I think next time we talk to Bob, I think one thing we've got to figure out is like where Batman came from. So that's the interesting thing. We have asked Bob a lot of questions, and he knows a lot about, specifically vehicle designs and concepts like that. He does not know a lot about things outside of the vehicle design. So some of these things were found in the Cedarholm collection, but we really don't know like who decided to do Bullet Man, why. There's still a lot of questions for the adventure team that hopefully over time we can unravel. As Bob has given us more names to kind of chase down from either marketing departments or others that we hope to do. But there's all these vac metal treatments for Bullet Man. Like every part was vac metalled in gold and silver. They were looking at like what's going to really look good, and ultimately how much can we afford to put on Bullet Man. But at one time the concept was fully vac metal Bullet Man, but ultimately, obviously, they went with just the arms and gave him a helmet. There's some other interesting concepts that were in there. It's the command paradrop concept, the initial shot in brown with a white parachute, which is really cool. And then the challenge of the Savage River. This is the challenge of the Savage River raft. It is not an inflatable raft. It is a heat-sealed vinyl surrounding like a rolled fill interior. It's meant to be sturdy. I think it's really meant to show management a concept, and especially for any kind of photo shoots, because this will not, wither under the glare of a hot light, or wouldn't lose any air. So one would assume that this is what they use for photos. And then there's some more.
Okay. So this was a club produced item from 2017. I will say, I argued against this concept. It went with a figure that I designed. I argued against this concept. I thought it was absurd to put anything valuable in the most valuable thing in the room, because like they're going to be stealing that anyways. So it's like, why would you hide your communications center inside of a mummy? But I lost. And so, but what was fascinating was it was not an original, unbeknownst to us, it was not an original idea, because we found this prototype. I don't know. Yeah, I have no idea. But you obviously, when they add that console, and you can no longer get the mummy inside there, but I guess they're just, I don't know.
So here's the.
You don't want to interrupt the decor of your lair, so you put your communications unit inside of a mummy.
So here's
right
the,
out of a mobile sport vehicle.
yep, it's just the cardboard just laid out, kind of repasted onto a flat thing that fits. And this is it's a repainted mummy's tomb. So inside you get that aqua,
still get the aqua, yep.
that teal of antiquity. And then with this modern thing. We don't know anything about this, but the fact it exists is like the coolest, is the coolest thing because, you know, they were playing with ideas and concepting all kind of things, kind of things.
To that end, we get the flocked intruder.
Yeah.
Not only is this a flocked intruder, but this is a flocked intruder with a Joe head that's overflocked. So that is a, either a land adventure or commander head that's been reflocked after being mounted on intruder body. There's just no explanation for some of this stuff. So, and yet he saved it.
Yep.
Yep.
And so we did finally get our answer to the initial question that we asked, which is, what are the Surgicos, Joe? So the whole thing started with me talking to Fred Eddins and going, Fred, do you know anything about this? And the answer is actually less exotic than you may think. The actuality is Hasbro, and this will come up tomorrow in tomorrow's presentation as well. Hasbro had groups and divisions and equipment that was going underutilized in their current business, and they didn't want to lay them off or scrap the equipment because they had an investment in the equipment. So they asked the team to think of concepts that would fill the production line, that would utilize these resources. And so the Hasbro had a premiums division that just worked on selling concepts that could be manufactured to other companies, kind of like a business-to-business venture, not to the consumer, not to retailers. And so from the premiums division, this was designed as a concept to take that new G.I. Joe tool, that muscle body tool, and sell it to surgical companies. The simple idea was, hey, we make a figure that's a facsimile of a human body. Surely you medical companies could use like miniature human bodies, you know? And so it was designed to help sell scale-sized medical equipment. So a lot of times, furniture and other things, they may make a scale-sized model, to show what it's going to be. In cars, they do that. And so that was the idea here. So, and they were selling it to this company, Surgicos, which is a division of Johnson & Johnson. So Surgicos bought a couple of them, but didn't really go more than just these few. But it's interesting how different it was from everything else. So
This was not a huge demand for 1/6 scale MRI machines.
So kind of mystery solved on Surgicos, but I think everybody has seen probably the most popular product that came from the premiums division here, which is the Nestle Quick Mug. They made a bazillion of these Nestle Quick Mugs out of that same factory in Rhode Island from the premiums division, just taking advantage of idle production time on the line. So they made a lot of stuff like that. I don't know everything the premiums division made, but certainly this is one of them. And tomorrow we'll have more interesting mysteries and tantalizing tidbits for everybody.
Thank you.
More new info.
Yep.
All right, next up is the G.I. Joe Hall of Fame, the origins